In the cold November of 1877, in the coal mining region of western Pennsylvania, near the town of Johnstown, 34 miners from the Blackridge Coal Company descended into shaft number 7 for their regular shift and never returned to the surface alive. What made their deaths particularly disturbing was not the manner of their dying, though that was tragic enough, but the circumstances that led to it. According to the testimony of 3 miners who survived the incident, the men had been following voices that they heard in the deepest parts of the mine, voices that seemed to be calling to them, guiding them deeper into unexplored sections of the tunnels, leading them away from safety and toward a collapse that would trap and kill them nearly 1,000 feet underground. The incident raised troubling questions about what the miners had actually heard, whether the voices were hallucinations produced by dangerous gases in the mine, whether they represented some form of collective delusion or mass hysteria, or whether, as some of the survivors and family members insisted, the men had genuinely heard something in those dark tunnels that had called to them and led them to their deaths. The disaster would expose the dangerous conditions in Pennsylvania's coal mines, the psychological toll that underground work took on miners, and the thin line between rational explanation and the supernatural fears that haunted men who spent their lives working in darkness beneath millions of tons of rock. The Blackridge mining disaster, as it came to be known, would also contribute to growing labor unrest in Pennsylvania's coal fields, as miners and their families questioned whether the deaths had been truly accidental, or whether the company's negligence and dangerous practices had created conditions that made such disasters inevitable. The incident became a rallying point for those advocating for better mine safety regulations, for improved working conditions, and for greater accountability when miners died in incidents that might have been prevented. But perhaps most disturbing were the accounts from the 3 survivors, men who had been part of the group that followed the voices, but who had turned back before the collapse occurred. Their descriptions of what they heard in those deep tunnels, of the compelling nature of the voices, of how difficult it was to resist following them deeper into the mine, suggested something more complex and more troubling than simple hallucination or gas exposure. These men described feeling drawn forward against their better judgment, feeling compelled to continue despite knowing that they were moving away from mapped tunnels and into dangerous unexplored areas. Their testimony suggested that whatever had occurred in shaft number 7 went beyond conventional explanations, touching on questions about human perception, about the psychological effects of extreme environments, and about what might exist in the deep places of the earth that humans were never meant to enter. Before we continue with the disturbing story of the Blackridge mining disaster and the voices that led 34 men to their deaths, subscribe to Shadows of America and hit that notification bell. We release hour-long investigations every day at 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. EST. Let us know in the comments what state you're watching from, and share this video with someone who needs to hear these forgotten stories. The Pennsylvania coal fields in the 1870s were among the most productive and most dangerous mining regions in the United States. Coal was the primary fuel for industrial America, powering factories, heating homes, and driving the locomotives that connected the expanding nation. The demand for coal was insatiable, and mining companies pushed their workers to extract as much coal as quickly as possible, often with minimal regard for safety or for the toll that the work took on the men who descended into the earth each day. The Blackridge Coal Company operated several mines in the mountains west of Johnstown, employing approximately 800 miners and their support workers across multiple shafts that reached depths of up to 1,200 feet below the surface. The work was brutally hard, conducted in near-complete darkness, broken only by the dim light of oil lamps, in tunnels that were often barely high enough to stand in air that was frequently thick with coal dust, and sometimes contaminated with dangerous gases that could kill or cause explosions. The miners themselves came from diverse backgrounds, many of them immigrants from Ireland, Wales, Poland, and Italy, who had come to America seeking opportunities and had ended up in the coal mines because it was work that required little English and no formal education. They lived in company towns where the Blackridge Company owned the houses, the stores, and effectively controlled every aspect of workers' lives. They were paid in company scrip that could only be spent at company stores, keeping them in a cycle of debt and dependence that made it nearly impossible to leave even when conditions were dangerous or unfair. Shaft number 7 had been opened in 1874 and extended to a depth of approximately 1,000 feet, reaching a particularly rich seam of anthracite coal that the company was eager to exploit. The shaft had a reputation among the miners as being an unlucky or haunted location, though such superstitions were common in mining communities, where death was a constant presence, and where the darkness and isolation of underground work bred fears and legends. Several miners had died in shaft number 7 since it opened, from accidents, from gas exposure, from rockfalls and other hazards that were occupational risks in all coal mines. But by late 1877, the superstitions about shaft 7 had intensified. Multiple miners reported hearing strange sounds in the deeper parts of the mine, sounds that didn't correspond to the normal acoustic phenomena of underground work. They described hearing voices calling their names, hearing what sounded like conversations or singing coming from unexplored tunnels, hearing knocking or tapping sounds that seemed to be signals, but that came from areas where no other workers should have been present. Most miners dismissed these reports as nerves or imagination, the product of working long shifts in darkness and isolation where the mind could play tricks, and where every sound echoed and distorted through rock passages. Thomas McCarrick, the shift foreman for Shaft 7, had been with the Blackridge Company for 12 years and had worked in multiple mines throughout western Pennsylvania. He was known as a hard but fair supervisor, someone who pushed his crews to maintain production, but who also had enough experience to recognize genuinely dangerous conditions and to refuse to send men into situations that were too hazardous. McCarrick himself had reportedly heard unusual sounds in Shaft 7 and had expressed concerns to company management about whether the deeper parts of the mine had been adequately surveyed and whether there might be structural issues or gas pockets that posed risks to the miners working there. But McCarrick's concerns had been dismissed by the company's mine superintendent, William Thornton, who insisted that Shaft 7 was as safe as any mine in the region, and that the reports of strange sounds were just superstitious workers letting their imaginations run wild. Thornton pressured McCarrick to maintain production levels and made it clear that foremen who couldn't control their crews and keep them working would be replaced by supervisors who could. Faced with the threat of losing his position and the income that supported his family, McCarrick had reluctantly continued operations in Shaft 7, though he remained uneasy about the conditions there. On the morning of November 19, 1877, McCarrick led a crew of 37 miners into Shaft 7 for what should have been a routine 10-hour shift. The crew included experienced miners and newer workers, men ranging in age from their late teens to their 50s, a typical mix for a mining operation. They descended the shaft in the cage elevator, reaching the 1,000-foot level where the main coal seam was being worked, and dispersed to their assigned work areas in the branching tunnels that extended from the main shaft. For the first several hours, the shift proceeded normally. The miners worked their sections, extracting coal with picks and shovels, loading it into carts that were pulled by mules to the main shaft, where it would be hoisted to the surface. The familiar rhythms of mining work, the sound of picks striking rock, the rumble of loaded carts, the occasional blasting, as crews used explosives to break through harder sections of coal, all created the acoustic environment that miners knew and expected. But around midday, several miners from different sections of the tunnel network began reporting to McCarrick that they were hearing voices calling from deeper in the mine, from areas beyond where the current workings extended. Patrick Brennan, a 32-year-old miner from Ireland, told McCarrick that he clearly heard someone calling his name, that the voice sounded like it was coming from an unexplored side tunnel about 50 yards beyond his work area. When McCarrick accompanied Brennan to investigate, both men reportedly heard sounds that seemed like distant conversation, though they couldn't make out specific words. Other miners reported similar experiences throughout the early afternoon. James Sullivan heard what sounded like a woman singing, which was impossible since no women were allowed in the mines. Anton Kowalski heard knocking sounds that seemed to be following a pattern, as if someone was trying to communicate. Michael O'Brien heard what he described as multiple voices talking together, as if there was a group of people having a discussion somewhere in the unexplored areas of the mine. The consistency of these reports across multiple miners working in different sections of Shaft 7 suggested that something was producing sounds that were being widely heard, not just isolated hallucinations or imagination. McCarrick, growing increasingly concerned, sent a runner to the surface to report the situation and to request guidance from the mine superintendent. But before any response could be received, a group of about 20 miners, apparently responding to something they heard, began moving together deeper into the mine, heading towards sections that had not yet been fully explored or mapped. Other miners, including McCarrick himself, called after them to stop, warning that they were leaving the safe areas of the mine and entering zones where the structural integrity hadn't been verified and where gas accumulations might be present. But the group of miners continued moving forward, apparently driven by a compulsion to follow the sounds they were hearing. Several of them called back to those watching that they could hear the voices clearly now, that the voices were calling them forward, that they needed to see what was there. The tone of these responses was described by survivors as strange, as if the men were in a kind of trance, or were so focused on what they were hearing, that they couldn't consider anything else. McCarrick and several other miners followed the advancing group, trying to convince them to turn back. But as they moved deeper into the unexplored sections, more miners joined the group heading forward, rather than turning back. The compelling nature of whatever they were hearing seemed to affect different people differently, with some men being completely drawn in, and others able to resist the pull. McCarrick himself later described feeling a strong urge to continue forward, hearing what sounded like his dead brother's voice calling to him, but managing to maintain enough rational awareness to recognize that this couldn't be real, and that continuing deeper into unmapped tunnels was extremely dangerous. By the time the advancing group had moved approximately 200 yards beyond the mapped sections of Shaft 7, 34 miners were in the forward party, all apparently following sounds that they heard and that compelled them to continue. McCarrick and 3 other miners, who had followed, but who had managed to resist the compulsion to go further, stopped at what they judged to be the safe limit of the explored mine, calling forward to the men ahead to turn back, warning them that the structural supports in the area they were entering were inadequate or non-existent, and that collapse was likely if they continued. For a moment, it seemed that some of the forward group might heed these warnings. Several miners near the back of the advancing group paused and appeared to be reconsidering. But then, according to the survivors' testimony, there was a sound from deeper in the tunnels that was described as a massive collective voice, as if dozens or hundreds of people were calling together, and the forward group surged ahead, moving faster now, almost running into the darkness, despite the dangerous footing and the obvious risks. McCarrick made the agonizing decision to turn back, recognizing that he and the few miners still with him would only add to the casualties if they continued forward, and that they had a responsibility to survive to report what had happened. As they began their retreat toward the main shaft, they heard a thunderous rumbling from behind them, the unmistakable sound of a major roof collapse. The entire section of tunnel that the forward group had entered had given way, bringing down thousands of tons of rock and sealing off the area completely. The 4 miners, who had turned back, reached the main shaft and raised the alarm. Within an hour, the entire crew from Shaft 7 had been evacuated to the surface, except for the 34 men who had been caught in the collapse. Rescue operations began immediately, with crews working to dig through the collapsed section to reach the trapped miners. But the extent of the collapse was massive, and the rescue workers faced constant danger from ongoing rockfalls and from the gases that were accumulating in the disturbed sections of the mine. Over the following 3 days, rescue crews worked continuously, removing tons of rock and timber in an effort to reach the trapped miners. Hope faded gradually as the hours passed, and as the conditions in the collapse area made it increasingly clear that survival would have been impossible. The entire section of tunnel had been completely crushed, leaving no air pockets or voids where miners might have sheltered. The force of the collapse had been so great that support timbers were shattered like matchsticks, and rock was pulverized into gravel. On November 22nd, 3 days after the collapse, the rescue operation was officially called off. The mine superintendent declared that further efforts would only endanger additional lives, and that the bodies of the 34 trapped miners would have to remain where they had fallen. The section of Shaft 7 where the collapse occurred would be sealed permanently, becoming a tomb for the men who had died there. The official inquiry into the Blackridge disaster began within days of the collapse. Company representatives initially attempted to characterize the incident as a tragic accident resulting from miners ignoring safety protocols and venturing into unsupported areas of the mine against orders. They claimed that Foreman McCarrick had explicitly warned the men not to enter unmapped sections, and that the miners had disobeyed these instructions, making their deaths the result of their own recklessness rather than any failure of company safety practices. But McCarrick's testimony contradicted this narrative. He described how the miners had appeared to be responding to something they heard, how they seemed compelled to move forward despite warnings, and how even he had felt a strong urge to follow the sounds deeper into the mine. He emphasized that the men who had continued forward were not disobedient or reckless workers, but were experienced miners who understood the dangers and who would not normally have taken such risks. Something had affected their judgment and their behavior in ways that McCarrick couldn't explain, but that went beyond simple negligence or poor decision-making. The 3 miners who had survived by turning back with McCarrick provided even more detailed and troubling testimony. Patrick Sullivan, age 28, described hearing what sounded like his mother's voice calling him forward, speaking in Irish and using endearments she had used when he was a child. Sullivan's mother had died 3 years earlier in Ireland, and he was certain that what he heard was her voice, though he recognized rationally that this was impossible. He described feeling an overwhelming need to go to her, to find where the voice was coming from, and only managing to turn back because of McCarrick's repeated warnings and physical intervention. Anton Kowalski, age 35, described hearing multiple voices speaking in Polish, having what sounded like a celebration or party. He recognized the voices as belonging to friends from his village in Poland, some of whom had died in a mining accident years before. The voices were calling him to join them, saying there was food and drink, and that everyone was waiting for him. Kowalski described feeling happy and excited about going to this gathering, even though part of his mind knew it couldn't be real, that his dead friends couldn't be having a party in an unexplored section of a Pennsylvania coal mine. James O'Neill, age 42, the 3rd survivor, described his experience differently. He heard what sounded like dozens of people singing hymns, beautiful harmonies that filled the tunnels and seemed to resonate through the rock itself. He felt drawn toward the sound, wanting to see who was singing and to join in the hymn. But unlike the other men, O'Neill described feeling an increasing sense of wrongness as he moved forward, a growing certainty that the music, however beautiful, was dangerous, that it was luring him towards something harmful rather than towards something good. This feeling had given him the strength to resist and to turn back, despite the compelling nature of what he was hearing. All three survivors emphasized that what they heard was not imaginary or hallucinatory in any ordinary sense. They heard specific voices, speaking specific words, in ways that suggested the sounds were real acoustic phenomena rather than mental constructions. They also described the compelling nature of the voices as being different from normal temptation or desire, as if the sounds had some power to override normal judgment and caution, to make continuing forward seem like the only reasonable choice, despite obvious dangers. The inquiry commissioners were skeptical of these accounts, suggesting that the miners had likely been affected by dangerous gases in the unexplored sections of the mine, perhaps carbon monoxide or other substances that could cause auditory hallucinations and impaired judgment. They brought in mining engineers and physicians to evaluate whether gas exposure could explain what the miners had experienced and what had caused the large group to act in such apparently irrational and self-destructive ways. Dr. Harold Simmons, a physician with experience treating miners suffering from gas exposure and other occupational health problems, testified that various gases found in coal mines could indeed cause hallucinations, confusion, and impaired judgment. Carbon monoxide, which was produced by incomplete combustion and which could accumulate in poorly ventilated mine sections, was known to cause headaches, dizziness, and in severe cases, hallucinations and unconsciousness. Methane, while primarily dangerous because of its explosiveness, could also displace oxygen in enclosed spaces and cause symptoms that might include auditory distortions or hallucinations. But Dr. Simmons also acknowledged that the specific pattern of symptoms described by the survivors didn't match well with typical gas exposure cases. Gas-affected miners usually experienced gradual onset of symptoms, beginning with headache and dizziness, before progressing to more severe effects. They typically showed visible signs of distress, changes in complexion, difficulty breathing, and other physical manifestations that observers would have noticed. The Blackridge miners, according to McCarrick's testimony, had appeared physically normal right up until they began responding to the voices, showing no signs of respiratory distress or other symptoms that would indicate gas exposure. Moreover, gas exposure typically affected all miners in an area relatively uniformly, with those closest to the source, or those who were most vulnerable, experiencing the strongest effects. But in the Blackridge incident, miners working in the same sections of Shaft 7 had been affected very differently, with some hearing compelling voices and others hearing nothing unusual, with some being completely drawn forward and others able to resist, despite hearing the same sounds. This selective pattern was difficult to explain through gas exposure, which should have affected all miners in a given area, similarly based on the concentration of the gas and their physical proximity to it. An alternative theory proposed during the inquiry was that the miners had experienced a form of mass hysteria or collective delusion, triggered perhaps by the existing superstitions about Shaft 7 and by the stress and fear that were inherent in underground mining work. Psychologists in the 1870s were beginning to understand how suggestion and social influence could cause groups of people to share unusual experiences or to engage in behaviors that individuals would not typically display on their own. Cases of mass hysteria had been documented in various settings, often involving groups of people under stress who shared strong beliefs or expectations that made them susceptible to collective experience of symptoms or perceptions that had no external cause. But this explanation also struggled to account for specific features of the Blackridge incident. Mass hysteria typically involved symptoms that were vague or that could be easily produced by psychological suggestion, things like fainting, tremors, or generalized feelings of distress. The Blackridge miners described very specific auditory experiences, hearing distinct voices speaking identifiable languages, recognizing the voices as belonging to specific people, hearing content that was detailed and personal. This level of specificity seemed beyond what would be expected from collective delusion or from psychological suggestion alone. The inquiry also heard testimony about other unusual phenomena reported in Shaft 7 prior to the November 19 disaster. Several miners described experiencing temperature changes in certain sections of the mine that didn't correspond to normal variations. They reported feeling sudden cold drafts in areas where no air movement should have occurred, or finding pockets of warmth that had no obvious source. Some miners reported that their lamps would flicker or dim when they entered certain tunnels, as if something was interfering with the combustion, or as if there was air movement that wasn't visible or audible to the miners themselves. There were also reports of visual phenomena, though these were less common and less consistent than the auditory experiences. Several miners described seeing what looked like movement in their peripheral vision, shadows that seemed to shift or move in ways that didn't correspond to the movement of lamps or workers. A few reported seeing what appeared to be lights deep in unexplored tunnels, faint glows that would appear briefly and then disappear, as if someone was carrying a lamp in areas where no one should have been present. These reports, while intriguing, were difficult to verify or to connect definitively to the disaster. They might have been genuine observations of unusual phenomena in the mine, or they might have been the result of the power of suggestion once the superstitions about Shaft 7 became established in the mining community. Once miners believed the mine was haunted or dangerous in supernatural ways, they might interpret normal variations in temperature, normal optical effects from poor lighting, or normal acoustic phenomena as evidence of something unusual or threatening. The inquiry ultimately concluded that the Blackridge disaster had resulted from a combination of factors, including inadequate surveying of the mine's deep sections, insufficient structural support in areas where miners were working, possible exposure to dangerous gases that affected judgment, and the psychological effects of working in extremely stressful and dangerous conditions that made miners vulnerable to suggestion and to acting on perceptions that might not have had basis in physical reality. The commissioners recommended stricter safety regulations for Pennsylvania coal mines, including requirements for more thorough surveying before miners entered new sections, improved ventilation systems to reduce gas accumulation, better structural support in all working areas, and limits on the depth that mines could be extended without comprehensive engineering review. The Blackridge Coal Company was assessed significant fines for safety violations and was required to improve conditions at all its mine sites. Shaft number 7 was permanently sealed, with concrete and rubble filling the main shaft and closing off all access to the sections where the 34 miners had died. The families of the dead miners received modest compensation payments from the company, though these were far from adequate to replace the lost income and to support widows and orphans who faced uncertain futures without their breadwinners. But the official conclusions did little to satisfy many in the mining community, particularly the families of the dead miners and those who had known the men and who had difficulty accepting that experienced rational miners had simply made catastrophically bad decisions for no clear reason. The survivors' accounts of hearing voices that called them forward, that seemed to have power to override normal judgment and caution, suggested to many that something beyond normal explanation had occurred in Shaft 7, that the men had encountered something in the deep places of the earth that had led them to their deaths. These beliefs were reinforced by stories that circulated in the months following the disaster. Workers at other Blackridge mines reported hearing strange sounds in their own deep workings, sounds that seemed similar to what had been described by the Shaft 7 survivors. Some miners refused to work in the deepest sections of mines, fearing they might hear the voices that had killed their colleagues. Superstitions about haunted or cursed mines proliferated, with Shaft 7 becoming a legendary example of the dangers that might exist beyond normal physical hazards. The incident also contributed to growing labor unrest in Pennsylvania's coalfields. Miners had always known that their work was dangerous, that death was a constant possibility in the mines. But the Blackridge disaster, with its suggestion that men might be led to their deaths by forces they couldn't understand or resist, created new anxieties about whether any safety regulations or precautions could truly protect workers when the threats they faced might go beyond physical dangers like collapse or gas explosion, to include psychological or even supernatural hazards. Union organizers used the disaster to argue for greater worker control over safety decisions, for the right of miners to refuse to enter sections of mines they believed were unsafe, regardless of management pressure to maintain production. They pointed to Foreman McCarrick's earlier concerns about Shaft 7, concerns that had been dismissed by company management, as evidence that workers' safety judgments should carry weight equal to or greater than management's financial interests. The Blackridge case also attracted attention from researchers interested in the psychology of groups and in how extreme environments affected human perception and behavior. Several academics visited the mining region in the years following the disaster, interviewing survivors and other miners, attempting to understand the specific circumstances that had led to the incident and to identify whether there were common factors in cases where miners reported unusual auditory or other sensory experiences underground. Dr. William James, the prominent psychologist and philosopher, corresponded with McCarrick and with the 3 surviving miners, asking detailed questions about their experiences and about how the voices they heard had affected their thinking and decision-making. James was interested in questions about the nature of perception, about whether the line between hallucination and real sensory experience was as clear as generally assumed, and about whether extreme conditions might allow people to perceive things that were not normally accessible to human senses. In writings based partly on his investigation of the Blackridge case, James suggested that the miners might have experienced a form of what he called veridical hallucination, perceptions that, while not corresponding to normal physical stimuli, might nonetheless be responding to real phenomena that weren't yet understood by science. He proposed that the deep mines, with their unique acoustic properties, their isolation from normal environmental factors, and their extreme conditions of pressure, darkness, and danger, might create circumstances where human perception operated differently than in ordinary settings, potentially becoming sensitive to sounds or other stimuli that would be undetectable on the surface. Other researchers rejected this interpretation, arguing that there was no credible basis for believing that mines contained anything beyond normal physical phenomena, and that the Blackridge incident could and should be explained entirely through conventional factors like gas exposure, psychological stress, and the power of suggestion. They viewed James's theorizing as giving too much credence to superstitious beliefs and to testimony that might have been distorted by trauma, by the need to make sense of tragedy, or by community narratives that had developed after the fact. These debates about how to interpret the Blackridge disaster continued for years, with the incident becoming a reference point in broader discussions about the limits of scientific explanation, about how to evaluate testimony regarding unusual experiences, and about whether extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence, or whether testimony from credible witnesses should be taken at face value, even when it described events that didn't fit easily into existing frameworks of understanding. For the mining community, regardless of academic debates about the nature of what had occurred, the practical lessons were clear. Deep mines were dangerous in ways that went beyond the obvious physical hazards of rock collapse and gas explosion. The psychological toll of working deep underground, in darkness and isolation, under constant threat of injury or death, created vulnerabilities that could lead to impaired judgment or to experiences that might not be fully explicable through conventional means. Protecting miners required not just physical safety measures, but also attention to the psychological and social factors that affected how miners perceived and responded to the environments they worked in. The 3 survivors of the Blackridge disaster carried the trauma of their experience for the rest of their lives. All 3 left coal mining within a year of the incident, unable to continue working in the environment that had nearly killed them and that had taken so many of their colleagues. Patrick Sullivan returned to Ireland, where he lived until his death in 1904, reportedly never speaking publicly about his experiences in Shaft 7 after giving his testimony to the inquiry. Anton Kowalski moved to Pittsburgh, where he worked in steel mills and maintained contact with other Polish immigrants from the coal fields, but similarly avoided discussing the disaster, except in the most general terms. James O'Neill, the survivor, who had described feeling a sense of wrongness about the voices he heard, had perhaps the most difficult adjustment. He experienced recurring nightmares about the disaster, dreams in which he heard the voices again, and in which he sometimes chose to continue forward rather than turning back, following his colleagues to death in the collapsed tunnel. He struggled with survivor's guilt, questioning why he had been able to resist the voices when so many others had not, wondering whether there was something he could have done to save more of the men who died. O'Neill eventually became involved in mine safety advocacy, working with union organizers to push for better safety regulations and for greater worker power to refuse dangerous assignments. He testified before the Pennsylvania legislature about his experiences in Shaft 7, arguing that miners needed the right to trust their instincts about danger and that companies should not be allowed to pressure workers into situations that felt wrong or unsafe, regardless of whether the danger could be precisely quantified or rationally explained. Foreman Thomas McCarrick never returned to mining after the disaster. He had lost 34 men under his supervision, men who had been his responsibility to protect. Though the inquiry had largely exonerated him of blame, finding that he had acted reasonably given the unusual circumstances, and that he had tried to prevent the men from continuing into the dangerous section, McCarrick held himself accountable for their deaths. He moved his family to Ohio, where he worked as a farm laborer and later as a shop clerk, leaving the coal mining life behind, but carrying the memory of November 19, 1877, until his death in 1899. The families of the dead miners received limited compensation, but faced difficult futures in an era before social welfare programs or workers' compensation systems. The loss of a male breadwinner often meant economic catastrophe for families. Widows struggled to support children on their own, often working multiple jobs or depending on charity. Children were forced to leave school and enter the workforce at young ages to help support their families. Some families broke apart, with children being sent to live with relatives, or in the worst cases, to orphanages, when widowed mothers couldn't manage to care for them. The community of Johnstown and the surrounding mining region was deeply affected by the disaster. 34 men, dead in a single incident, was a massive blow to a small community, touching nearly every family in some way, through kinship, friendship, or neighborhood connection. The tragedy reinforced the sense that coal mining was not just dangerous work, but that it extracted terrible costs from those who depended on it for their livelihoods. The disaster contributed to exodus from the coal fields, as families sought safer and more secure ways of earning a living, though for many, options were limited, and mining remained the only available work. The sealed entrance to Shaft 7 became an unofficial memorial site, with families visiting to leave flowers or to say prayers for the men who remained entombed in the collapsed tunnels beneath. The Blackridge Company made no official memorial, but the mining community maintained the site and passed down stories about the disaster to younger generations, ensuring that the 34 men who died following voices into the darkness, would not be forgotten. Over the decades that followed, the Blackridge disaster became part of the folklore of Pennsylvania's coal country, a cautionary tale told to new miners about the dangers of going too deep, of venturing into unexplored areas, of following anything in the mines, except the clear directions of experienced foremen. The specific details often became embellished or distorted in the retelling, with some versions claiming that the voices had been those of demons or evil spirits, others suggesting they had been the ghosts of miners who had died previously in Shaft 7, still others proposing that the men had discovered an entrance to hell itself in those deep tunnels. These folkloric elaborations, while not faithful to the documented facts of the case, captured something important about how the disaster was understood in the mining community. Whether or not anything supernatural had occurred in Shaft 7, the incident represented the mysterious and terrifying aspects of mining work, the sense that descending into the earth meant entering a realm where normal rules might not apply, where familiar dangers like rock, falls, and gas explosions were accompanied by stranger threats that couldn't be easily named or protected against. Modern researchers who have examined the Blackridge case have proposed various explanations for what the miners might have experienced. Some point to the possibility of infrasound, very low-frequency sound waves below the threshold of conscious hearing, but which can produce feelings of unease, anxiety, and in some cases auditory hallucinations. These sounds can be produced by geological processes, by air movement through rock formations, by distant rockfalls or earth movements, and might have been present in Shaft 7 without being consciously perceived as sound by the miners. Others have suggested that the miners might have been affected by electromagnetic fields produced by geological formations or by the movement of fault lines deep in the earth. There is some research suggesting that electromagnetic fields can affect brain function and can produce various perceptual anomalies, including auditory hallucinations. The geology of western Pennsylvania includes numerous faults and formations that might have produced unusual electromagnetic conditions in deep mines. Carbon monoxide exposure remains another possible explanation, though as noted earlier, the symptom pattern didn't match typical gas poisoning cases perfectly. It's possible that the concentration of gas was at a level that affected perception and judgment without causing obvious physical distress, creating a kind of altered state where miners interpreted ambiguous acoustic phenomena as coherent voices speaking personally meaningful content. Still others point to the possible role of suggestion and expectation, noting that once the first miners began reporting hearing voices, others might have become primed to interpret any ambiguous sounds or sensations as similar phenomena. The social dynamics of a mining crew, where men worked in close proximity and depended on each other for safety, might have amplified the effects of suggestion, causing experiences to spread through the group in ways that wouldn't occur among individuals working independently. The psychological stress of mining work itself may have played a role. Men who spent 10 to 12 hours per day in near-complete darkness, performing exhausting physical labor under constant threat of death, might have been in psychological states where perception was altered, where the boundary between internal mental experience and external sensory input became less distinct. The human mind under such extreme stress might create experiences that felt entirely real and external, even though they originated internally. But none of these explanations fully accounts for all the features of the Blackridge incident. The specific and personal nature of what the miners heard, voices of dead relatives speaking in their native languages, using intimate terms of address that would not be known to other miners, is difficult to explain through simple hallucination or suggestion. The compelling power of the voices that caused experienced workers to ignore obvious dangers, and the judgment of their foremen suggests something more than normal perceptual distortion. the selective effect that caused some miners to be powerfully affected while others in the same location were not challenges explanations based on environmental factors that should have affected everyone present. Perhaps the most honest assessment is that the Blackridge disaster represents a genuine mystery, an incident where something unusual occurred, but where the evidence is insufficient to determine definitively what that something was. The miners heard voices that led them to their deaths. Whether those voices were hallucinations produced by gases or other physical factors, whether they were psychological phenomena arising from stress and suggestion, whether they represented perception of real but poorly understood phenomena, or whether they were something else entirely, remains uncertain. What is certain is that 34 men died in Shaft 7 on November 19, 1877, and that those deaths occurred under circumstances that challenged conventional understanding then and continue to resist complete explanation today. Their tragedy contributed to improvements in mine safety, raised important questions about the limits of human perception and the effects of extreme environments, and left a legacy that influenced how mining communities understood their relationship with the underground spaces where they worked. The Blackridge disaster also serves as a reminder that not all historical events fit neatly into our frameworks of understanding, that sometimes the past presents us with incidents that remain genuinely mysterious, even after careful investigation and analysis. The easy explanations that the miners were simply careless, or were all hallucinating due to gas exposure, or were victims of mass hysteria, don't fully account for what the credible witnesses reported experiencing. But the more extraordinary explanations, that the mines contained supernatural dangers, or that the miners encountered something genuinely paranormal, lack sufficient evidence to be accepted with confidence. The incident had lasting effects on mine safety regulations and practices throughout Pennsylvania and eventually across the United States. The inquiry's recommendations for improved surveying, better ventilation, and stronger structural support became incorporated into state mining laws over the following decades. The principle that workers should have the right to refuse assignments they believed were unsafe, though not fully established in law until much later, gained support partly from cases like Blackridge, where experienced miners' instincts about danger had proven correct, even when management dismissed their concerns. The disaster also influenced how mining companies approached the psychological well-being of their workers. While the concept of occupational mental health was not well developed in the 1870s, some more progressive mining operations began recognizing that the extreme stress and isolation of deep mining work could affect workers' mental state and judgment. They implemented policies like limiting the length of continuous shifts, requiring regular breaks and rotation out of the deepest sections, and paying attention to signs that workers might be experiencing psychological distress that could compromise safety. Labor unions in the coal fields used the Blackridge case as a rallying point for organizing efforts. The disaster demonstrated the life and death importance of workers having collective power to advocate for safety, to resist company pressure, to maintain production at any cost, and to ensure that concerns about dangerous conditions were taken seriously. The United Mine Workers and other labor organizations that grew stronger in the 1880s and 1890s frequently cited Blackridge and similar disasters when arguing for the necessity of union representation and collective bargaining over safety issues. The families of the dead miners, while never fully recovering from their losses, eventually found some measure of peace, or at least acceptance. The children who had lost fathers grew up, many leaving the mining regions for opportunities elsewhere, carrying memories of fathers they barely knew, and of a disaster that had defined their early lives. The widows remarried in some cases, or made lives for themselves through work and community support, or moved to live with relatives who could help them manage. Time softened the immediate pain of loss, though it never erased the impact of what had occurred. The three survivors, Sullivan, Kowalski, and O'Neill, each processed their experiences differently over the years. Sullivan's decision to return to Ireland and his refusal to speak about the disaster suggests he may have sought to separate himself completely from the trauma, to return to familiar surroundings, where he could avoid reminders of what had occurred. Kowalski's move to industrial work in Pittsburgh allowed him to remain in Pennsylvania, but in a very different environment from the coal mines, perhaps finding some comfort in crowds and noise that were very different from the isolation and darkness of Shaft 7. O'Neill's choice to become a mine safety advocate represents another form of processing trauma, channeling his survival and his guilt into efforts that might prevent similar disasters and that might give meaning to his experience. His testimony before legislative committees and his work with unions kept him connected to the mining community, but in a role where he could actively work to improve conditions rather than simply trying to forget what had happened. Dr. William James's continued interest in the case throughout his career reflects the intellectual challenge it represented. In his later writings on psychology and philosophy, James occasionally returned to the Blackridge disaster as an example of the complexities of human perception and the difficulties of drawing clear lines between subjective experience and objective reality. He argued that dismissing the miners' testimony as simple hallucination or delusion was intellectually lazy, that taking their experiences seriously required grappling with difficult questions about the nature of consciousness and about whether there might be aspects of reality that were not easily captured by mechanistic scientific explanations. The site where Shaft 7 once stood is now abandoned, the sealed entrance long since covered over by vegetation and erosion. There is no marker indicating what occurred there, no memorial to the 34 men who lie entombed in the collapsed tunnels beneath. The Blackridge Coal Company itself ceased operations in the 1920s as the most accessible coal seams were exhausted and as mechanization changed the economics of coal mining. The company towns where miners lived have largely disappeared, their residents dispersed to other regions, the buildings demolished or left to decay. But the story of the Blackridge disaster persists in the historical record, in Dr. James's writings, in the testimony preserved in the inquiry records, in the occasional scholarly article that examines the case from various disciplinary perspectives. It remains one of the most puzzling and disturbing mining disasters in American history, not because of the number of casualties. Other incidents killed far more miners, but because of the circumstances that led to those deaths and the questions those circumstances raise about human perception, about the effects of extreme environments, and about the limits of what we can know and explain about unusual experiences. For anyone interested in the history of American labor, in the development of mine safety regulations, in the psychology of groups and perception, or in cases where historical events resist easy explanation, the Blackridge disaster provides a rich and troubling example. It asks us to take seriously the testimony of credible witnesses, even when what they describe doesn't fit our expectations, to acknowledge that not every historical mystery has a definitive solution, and to recognize that the past sometimes presents us with genuine puzzles that remain unsolved, despite our best efforts at analysis and understanding. The 34 miners who died in Shaft 7 on November 19, 1877, following voices into the darkness, remind us that the underground world where millions of workers spent their lives in pursuit of the coal that powered industrial America was not just physically dangerous, but was also psychologically demanding, in ways that we are only beginning to understand. Whether what they heard was produced by gases, by geological phenomena, by psychological stress, or by something else entirely, their deaths were real, and their tragedy deserves to be remembered not just as a workplace accident, but as an incident that challenged and continues to challenge our understanding of human experience in extreme environments. The voices in Shaft 7, whatever their source, claimed 34 lives. The 3 men who heard the voices but turned back carried the memory of what they heard for the rest of their lives. The families left behind struggled with loss and with questions that could never be fully answered. And the mining community learned once again that the depths of the earth held dangers that went beyond falling rock and explosive gas, dangers that might be all the more threatening because they couldn't be easily named or understood. What do you think happened in Shaft 7? Were the voices hallucinations produced by gas or by psychological stress? Could they have been some natural phenomenon that we don't yet understand? What does this case tell us about the limits of human perception and about how we evaluate testimony regarding unusual experiences? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this investigation compelling, subscribe to Shadows of America. We release documentaries like this every day at 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. EST. Hit that like button, share this video, and let us know what state you're watching from. The past is never truly buried, it's just waiting in the shadows.